You never think the quiet comfort of your own neighborhood could turn into a scene straight out of a crime thriller, but that's exactly what happened the day my daughter came over to visit. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when kids ride their bikes down the sidewalks, sprinklers water neatly trimmed lawns, and neighbors wave hello as they mow their grass. Everything seemed perfectly normal, calm, and safe. That illusion shattered in less than a minute when a man who claimed to be the neighborhood's security officer decided to make a very big mistake. My daughter had just pulled her SUV into the driveway. She was coming to spend the weekend at home, unwind from the heavy weight of her job, and just relax with family. She had her hair tied back, sunglasses on, and was dressed casually. She didn't look anything like what she really was. A highly trained FBI tactical commander with years of experience handling armed criminals, dangerous standoffs, and situations most people only see in movies. To anyone else, she looked like an ordinary young woman visiting her parents. And maybe that's why this man thought he could intimidate her. She had barely cut the engine when a figure approached from across the street. He was stocky, with a buzz cut, mirrored sunglasses, and a cheap black polo shirt with the word "security" stitched in white across the chest. Hanging from his belt was a holster, and sitting in that holster was a firearm he had no business carrying. He walked fast, puffing his chest like he owned the whole block, his boots hitting the pavement hard enough to be heard from inside the car. My daughter noticed him immediately in her side mirror, her instincts sharpening even though she was technically off duty. Something about his stride screamed aggression, not professionalism. She rolled down her window just a few inches, prepared to say hello, but before she could even greet him, his voice cut through the air like a siren. "You can't park here." "Who are you?" "Show me your ID right now," he demanded. His tone wasn't firm or authoritative, it was hostile, dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from someone who craves power but doesn't actually know how to wield it. My daughter calmly replied, "This is my parents' house. I'm here to visit." She thought that would be enough. It wasn't. The man took 2 more heavy steps forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun as though he were about to draw it. "Don't lie to me. I know who lives here, and you're not on the list. Get out of the car. Now," he barked. His voice was loud enough that a couple of neighbors watering their lawns turned to watch. Inside the SUV, my daughter's heartbeat stayed steady. Years of training taught her how to control fear, how to analyze threats, how to keep her cool when someone else was on the edge of violence. But even she had to blink in disbelief when the man suddenly pulled the weapon halfway out of its holster and pointed it directly at her windshield. Her body tensed, though her expression stayed calm. She knew what this meant. This wasn't a neighborhood nuisance anymore. This was an armed assault. At that moment, I was still inside the house, totally unaware of what was unfolding just 20 feet from my front door. My daughter, however, was locked into a situation most people would consider life or death. The man shouted again, "Step out of the car. Step out or I swear I'll drag you out myself." His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger, his stance sloppy but still enough to make anyone nervous. He wasn't a professional, that much was obvious. He was a bully with a gun, a man who thought his role as the HOA's hired muscle gave him the right to threaten whoever he wanted. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that the woman sitting behind that windshield wasn't just some random visitor he could push around. She wasn't some frightened homeowner's daughter who would shake and hand over her ID. She was a federal agent, one of the most skilled tactical commanders in the FBI, trained to face cartel members, armed fugitives, and domestic terrorists. She had been in situations where lives hung on a single decision, where seconds meant everything. And now, she was facing a wannabe cop who thought pointing a gun at her would make her submit. He had no idea he was standing on the edge of a cliff he couldn't climb back from. My daughter slowly raised her hands, palms open, her face unreadable. To any onlooker, it might have seemed like she was complying, that she was about to step out in fear. But what she was really doing was calculating. She measured the angle of his gun, the distance between them, his balance, his breathing. She noticed the twitch in his left hand, the way his sunglasses slipped slightly down his nose as sweat dripped. He was nervous. Nervous men with guns are dangerous, but they are also sloppy. She could disarm him in under 3 seconds if he made the wrong move. For a split second, she considered her options. If she revealed her badge too soon, he might panic and pull the trigger out of fear. If she waited too long, he could escalate further, maybe even fire a warning shot. So she chose the path she had trained for: stay calm, stay steady, and prepare to strike if absolutely necessary. She lowered her voice and spoke clearly. "Sir, I think you need to lower your weapon. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." But instead of listening, he sneered. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm the authority here. You're trespassing, and I'll handle you my way." His knuckles whitened as he gripped the gun tighter, and his voice cracked with rage. To him, this was about control. To her, this was about survival. Neighbors were beginning to gather at the edge of their lawns, whispering, some pulling out their phones, unsure if they should call the police. The air was thick with tension, the kind you can almost taste, like metal on your tongue before a storm. My daughter kept her eyes locked on the man, her every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action the moment he made the wrong move. He thought he was in charge. He had no clue he was standing in the presence of someone who had spent her entire career dismantling men exactly like him, men who thought a gun gave them power, men who believed intimidation was the same as authority. And as the barrel of his weapon leveled fully at her chest through the glass, she knew the time for waiting was over. The man's sunglasses reflected her face as he shouted again, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "Out of the car now, or I'll make you regret it." His words were sharp, but underneath them was something my daughter recognized immediately: fear. Trained eyes can spot fear in an instant, and she could see the slight tremor in his arm, the uneven breaths he tried to mask with bravado. Fear mixed with arrogance was a dangerous cocktail, one she had seen plenty of times in her line of work. This wasn't control. This wasn't professionalism. This was a man completely out of his depth, armed with nothing but misplaced confidence and a firearm he didn't know how to handle properly. My daughter's voice stayed level, calm, commanding, the exact opposite of his shaky aggression. "Sir, listen to me. Pointing that weapon at me is a felony. You need to lower it before someone gets hurt." She spoke slowly, giving him every chance to back down, every opportunity to realize he was spiraling into a disaster he couldn't walk away from. But her words only seemed to inflame him further. He took another step forward, now standing barely a few feet from the driver's side door. "Don't threaten me. I'm in charge here. You think you can just come into this neighborhood and do whatever you want? Not on my watch. Get out, now." His hand jerked upward with the gun, the barrel twitching dangerously close to lining up with her face through the glass. From the sidewalk, neighbors gasped, some covering their mouths, others whispering frantically. A teenager across the street had his phone out, recording the entire scene. A woman yelled, "Call the cops." But my daughter knew the police wouldn't arrive in time. She also knew this wasn't a situation where waiting was safe. She could see it in his eyes, he was seconds away from pulling that trigger, maybe not out of intent but out of panic. That was the moment she decided. In one swift motion, she shoved the driver's side door open, slamming it into his knees with enough force to make him stumble backward. His arm flailed, the gun jerking upward toward the sky. Before he could regain balance, she was out of the vehicle, moving with lightning precision. Her hand shot forward, grabbing his wrist, twisting it at just the right angle to force his fingers open without giving him time to react. The gun clattered to the pavement, and with her other hand she shoved him down, forcing his body flat against the hood of her SUV. The entire move took less than 3 seconds. Neighbors didn't even have time to process what had happened before the weapon was no longer in his hand, and he was gasping in shock. He roared in frustration, thrashing beneath her grip, his face turning red as he realized the situation had flipped entirely. You assaulted me. You can't do this. I'm the security here. He bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. My daughter tightened her grip on his arm, bending it just enough to make him stop squirming. Her voice was steady, sharp, and laced with authority. You're done. The only thing you're in charge of now is staying still until real law enforcement gets here. She kicked his gun further away with her boot, sliding it across the driveway so it was completely out of reach. The crowd had grown by then. At least a dozen neighbors stood watching, phones out, murmuring to one another in disbelief. Some couldn't believe what they had just seen, a man who strutted around the neighborhood like a guard dog, now pinned and helpless under the control of the very woman he had tried to intimidate. The same man who had spent months patrolling the streets, threatening teenagers, barking at delivery drivers, and boasting about his authority was now reduced to flailing uselessly under the weight of someone he thought was easy prey. You can't do this to me. He screamed again, still trying to twist free. I work for the HOA. I have authority. His voice cracked on the word authority, as if even he didn't fully believe it anymore. My daughter leaned closer, speaking directly into his ear so the words pierced through his denial. You pointed a loaded weapon at me without cause. You threatened deadly force against a homeowner on private property. You don't have authority. You have a criminal record now. Her knee pressed into his back, her grip unyielding, her movements efficient but not excessive. She wasn't hurting him more than necessary, but she wasn't letting him move an inch either. To the onlookers, it was almost surreal, watching a woman barely taller than his shoulder disarm and restrain a man twice her size with surgical precision. That's the thing about training, it doesn't matter how big someone is. It doesn't matter how loud they scream. It's about skill, control, and knowing exactly what to do in the heat of the moment. And my daughter knew better than anyone. As he writhed and shouted, trying to salvage some shred of pride, she calmly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. She always carried them. It didn't matter if she was off duty, running errands, or visiting family, handcuffs were as standard for her as a wallet or car keys. With practiced ease, she clicked one cuff around his wrist, then wrestled his other arm behind his back and locked it in place. The sound of the cuffs snapping shut seemed to echo across the neighborhood, sealing his fate in a single metallic click. The crowd erupted in hushed disbelief. A man whispered to his wife, "Did you see that?" She took him down like it was nothing. A teenager muttered, "That was like a movie." The so-called security officer, now cuffed and humiliated, growled and spat insults. "You're gonna regret this. You don't know who you're messing with. The HOA backs me. They'll ruin you." His words rang hollow now, his bluster reduced to empty threats. My daughter ignored him. She crouched, picked up the weapon from the driveway, ejected the magazine with a smooth motion, and locked the slide open to clear the chamber. Holding the disarmed weapon up, she addressed the neighbors firmly. "This man just pointed a loaded firearm at me without justification. He is restrained, and the weapon is secured. Nobody is in danger." Her calm, controlled announcement quieted the crowd. There was something about her presence, the authority in her voice, the professional way she handled everything, that made people realize they weren't just watching some random altercation. They were witnessing something far bigger, something that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. And the man beneath her still hadn't figured it out. He kept struggling, trying to twist his head enough to spit out more excuses, his ego refusing to accept the reality of what had just happened. "I'm security. You can't arrest me. You don't have the power," but his words died in his throat when she finally pulled out her badge. She held it just above his head so he could see it clearly, the gold shield glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Special Agent Danielle Carter," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Tactical Commander." And you just made the biggest mistake of your life. For the first time, silence fell over him. His body went still. His mouth hung open. The neighbors collectively gasped, whispers breaking out like wildfire. The same man who had strutted around the neighborhood with false authority was now lying face down on the hood of a car, cuffed and caught by someone with real authority, authority he could never dream of holding. My daughter didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even raise her voice. She just stood over him, badge in one hand, secured firearm in the other, as the weight of what he had done finally began to sink in. And in that instant, everyone watching understood the truth. The so-called security guard hadn't just picked the wrong fight. He had picked the one fight he could never, ever win. I was still inside the house when I first heard the commotion. At first it sounded like raised voices, then a chorus of gasps from outside, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop because you know something isn't right. I rushed to the front window, pushing the curtain aside, and my heart nearly stopped at what I saw. My daughter had a man pinned to the hood of her SUV, one hand pressed firmly between his shoulder blades, the other holding a weapon angled safely away from the crowd. For a split second, I couldn't comprehend what was happening. This was supposed to be a calm Saturday afternoon. She was supposed to be here to relax. Instead, my driveway looked like a scene out of a police drama, except this wasn't fiction, it was real, and it was unfolding right in front of me. By the time I threw the front door open and ran outside, she had the man in handcuffs. I recognized him immediately. He was the same security guard the HOA had been bragging about hiring for the past few months. I had seen him patrolling the streets, barking orders at delivery trucks, and even stopping kids on their way home from school to demand their names. He was a nuisance, a power-hungry wannabe who loved the sound of his own voice, but I never thought he'd escalate to this. Now here he was, face red, shouting about authority as my daughter held him down with unshakable precision. The neighbors had gathered in a semicircle around the driveway. Some whispered nervously, some recorded on their phones, others just stared with wide eyes. The HOA had always insisted this man was there for our safety, but the sight of him cuffed and disarmed told a very different story. My daughter glanced up as I approached, her face calm but her eyes laser-focused. "Dad, stay back," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He's under control, but don't get too close." That's when I noticed the badge glinting in her hand. She had pulled it out, flashing it toward the crowd to make sure there was no confusion about who she was and why she had the authority to do what she had just done. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. People craned their necks to get a better look. "She's FBI," someone whispered. "No way, she's federal," another voice chimed in. Then came the ripple of realization. Everyone had known her as just my daughter who occasionally visited, the young woman with the calm smile and quiet demeanor. Nobody had any idea that behind that smile was a tactical commander who had trained teams to storm buildings, negotiate hostages, and take down armed criminals. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, they stared in awe. The man beneath her still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. He kept writhing, shouting nonsense, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is illegal. You can't arrest me. I work for the HOA. I'm security." He kept repeating those words as though saying them enough times would make them true. My daughter leaned closer, speaking directly into his ear with the steady authority that only years of experience could forge. "You're not security. You're a liability. You pulled a loaded firearm on a homeowner without cause. You're lucky I disarmed you before you did something irreversible." That was the moment the neighbors realized the full gravity of the situation. The man hadn't just been harassing someone. He had pulled a gun. On a homeowner. On me, by extension. On this neighborhood. And not just any homeowner, he had done it to someone who happened to be far more qualified to handle him than any of us could have imagined. People's expressions shifted from shock to anger. I could hear snippets of conversations around me. He pointed a gun at her. I told you he was unstable. The HOA hired this guy. The tide was turning, and it wasn't turning in his favor. My daughter stood tall, pulling him upright by his arm, her grip iron strong as she forced him to face the crowd. His sunglasses had fallen off, and for the first time, his eyes were visible, wild, darting, desperate. Everybody listen carefully, she said, her voice raised just enough to carry. My name is Special Agent Danielle Carter, FBI Tactical Commander. This individual drew a firearm on me without justification. He is under arrest. She spoke each word clearly, deliberately, so there was no mistaking her meaning. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, almost in unison, a wave of whispers swept through the group like a gust of wind. The man struggled again, trying to salvage the situation. She's lying. She's making this up. I was just doing my job. His words sounded hollow, flimsy compared to the authority with which she spoke. My daughter turned to him sharply. You're not licensed to carry. You're not registered as law enforcement. You are not qualified or authorized to act as security. And you just threatened a federal agent with a deadly weapon. You're finished. His face paled as her words sank in. For the first time, the bravado slipped. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He finally understood that this wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble where the HOA would back him up. This was federal, and the weight of his actions was about to come crashing down on him. As I stood there, my heart still pounding, I felt a swell of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Pride, fear, relief, anger, all of it at once. Pride, because my daughter had handled the situation flawlessly. Fear, because I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if she hadn't been trained, if she hadn't been who she was. Relief, because she was standing strong, unhurt, in control. And anger, because the HOA had unleashed this man onto our streets without oversight, without responsibility, without caring about the consequences. A woman from across the street shouted, so the HOA just gave a gun to some random guy? That's insane. Another neighbor added, we've been complaining about him for months. He harassed my son last week. More voices joined in, the anger spreading like wildfire. The HOA board members who lived on the block stood frozen in place, their faces pale, their authority crumbling in real time as they watched the spectacle they had created unravel in front of everyone. My daughter, meanwhile, remained focused. She kept her hand on the man's shoulder, ensuring he couldn't bolt, while with her other hand she held her phone to her ear. She spoke calmly into it, identifying herself, giving her location, and explaining the situation. I've got one in custody, she said firmly. Male, mid-40s, attempted assault with a firearm. Weapon secured. Local law enforcement requested for pickup. The efficiency with which she handled the call was staggering. To her, this was just another operation, another threat neutralized. To us, it was an earth-shattering revelation that the HOA's so-called protector had been nothing but a ticking time bomb. When she ended the call, she looked around at the crowd. Law enforcement is on the way, she announced. This man will be taken into custody. I need everyone to remain calm and give statements when asked. Nobody else is in danger. The neighbors nodded, murmuring agreement, their eyes filled with respect and gratitude. Some even clapped quietly, a small show of support for the woman who had just saved the day in ways most of us couldn't even begin to process. The man hung his head now, the fight drained out of him. He muttered under his breath, cursing, blaming everyone but himself. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. The neighbors knew. The HOA knew. And most importantly, he knew. He had lost. He had gone too far, and the price of his arrogance was now a set of cuffs digging into his wrists and a federal agent standing over him. And as I stood there beside my daughter, watching the man who had terrorized our neighborhood reduced to silence, I realized something important. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was an unveiling, a moment of truth, where the lies and the false authority crumbled, and the reality of who really held power, earned, disciplined, and legitimate, shone through for everyone to see. Within the hour, flashing lights lit up the end of the street. First came the local police cruisers, pulling up fast and parking diagonally across the road. Officers stepped out, hands on their holsters, scanning the crowd before their eyes landed on my daughter. The neighbors had already gathered tighter, whispering frantically, and when the police arrived, the murmurs swelled into a buzz of anticipation. This was it, the moment the so-called HOA security guard would finally face real consequences. My daughter stood steady, one hand still on the cuffed man's shoulder as if daring him to even try to move. Her other hand held the firearm she had secured, magazine removed, chamber cleared, held in such a way that the officers would immediately know it wasn't a threat. She called out with professional clarity, "Officers, I'm Special Agent Danielle Carter, FBI. Subject is restrained. Firearm is secured. Approach is safe." The officers froze for a second, their eyes flicking to one another before moving forward cautiously. One of them, a sergeant by the stripes on his sleeve, stepped up first. "Agent Carter, you said?" My daughter flipped her badge open without missing a beat, holding it steady for him to inspect. The officer leaned in, his eyes widening slightly as he read the credentials. His voice dropped. "Ma'am, we weren't told Federal was here." Danielle nodded sharply. "Off-duty visit." He escalated. "Drew a weapon on me. You'll want to take him into custody. He's been impersonating security under the HOA." The sergeant turned to the cuffed man, whose face was now slick with sweat, hair matted to his forehead. His arrogance had drained away the moment the word "Federal" was spoken. Now he looked more like a cornered animal, twitchy, desperate, as if still searching for a way to twist the narrative. "She's lying," he shouted hoarsely, his voice cracking. "She attacked me. I was doing my job." The sergeant's expression hardened. "Sir, your job doesn't include pointing a firearm at unarmed civilians. You'll be coming with us." He nodded to two officers, who stepped forward, their hands gripping the man's arms as they relieved my daughter of her hold and guided him toward the cruiser. The neighbors broke into louder chatter now, some even clapping, others jeering at the so-called guard. "That's what you get," someone yelled from across the street. "About time," another voice added. A woman near me turned, her face pale but her eyes blazing with anger. "He pulled a gun on her? In our neighborhood? What if it had been one of our kids?" The HOA board members, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, shifted uncomfortably. Their faces were pale, their smugness gone. They were trapped, cornered by their own negligence. And now everyone knew. As the officers loaded him into the back of the squad car, one of them carried the confiscated firearm carefully inside an evidence bag. Danielle explained what had happened step by step, her tone calm, precise, and professional. The officers listened closely, scribbling notes, nodding, confirming her account with the neighbors who had seen the whole thing. And every time someone stepped forward to describe what they had witnessed, the HOA's credibility shrank further. It wasn't just one person accusing their so-called guard of abuse of power, it was dozens, all lining up to tell stories of harassment, intimidation, and reckless behavior. The sergeant turned toward the HOA president, who was now standing stiffly with her arms crossed, face tight like she was sucking on a lemon. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, "we'll need to see his employment records, licensing, and authorization to act as security in this neighborhood." The president stammered, "Well, technically, he was. He was contracted, it's all handled through the HOA paperwork," but she was cut off by my daughter's sharp voice. "You're lying. He's not licensed. He's not bonded. He's not registered with the state as security. I checked after hearing stories about him the last time I visited. You've been employing an armed civilian illegally, and you gave him the power to harass residents." The president's face flushed crimson, her lips tightening into a thin line as the crowd erupted in gasps. The floodgates opened. Neighbors began shouting accusations toward the HOA leadership. "You let this guy threaten my delivery driver. He chased my son with a flashlight last week. He pulled over my husband like he was a cop." The anger was tangible, years of bottled-up frustration boiling over in one explosive moment. The HOA had hidden behind rules, fines, and intimidation for too long, and now their dirty secret had been exposed in the worst possible way. The sergeant raised his voice, trying to calm everyone down, but the damage was already done. The HOA board members looked like deer caught in headlights, realizing that their neighbors, once silent, once afraid of fines and retaliation, were no longer backing down. They had lost their grip. The so-called authority they had built around themselves was crumbling before their eyes, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the arrested guard sat in the back of the police cruiser, banging his head against the headrest, muttering curses under his breath. But his fate was sealed. Danielle had already radioed in for federal support, and within the hour, an unmarked SUV arrived. 2 federal agents stepped out, speaking briefly with her before conferring with local police. The charges were stacking quickly: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful possession of a firearm while impersonating security, impersonating law enforcement, reckless endangerment. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This man was facing serious prison time. And as for the HOA, the fallout began almost immediately. Neighbors began demanding emergency meetings. People spoke of lawsuits. One man shouted, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." A mother yelled, "You put our kids in danger." The HOA president tried to regain control, her voice quivering as she insisted, "We were only trying to keep the neighborhood safe," but nobody was buying it anymore. Safe wasn't the word that came to mind. Reckless, dangerous, irresponsible, those were the words circling through the crowd. Danielle approached me quietly amidst the chaos, her expression softening for the first time all afternoon. "Dad, you okay?" she asked. I nodded, though my chest still felt tight. "I'm fine, thanks to you," I said, my voice rough. "But what if you hadn't been here? What if it was your mother instead of you pulling into the driveway?" The thought chilled me, and I could see the flicker of anger in her eyes. "That's exactly why this can't be buried," she said. "They endangered everyone. This isn't just about me, it's about the whole neighborhood." She was right, of course. And it didn't take long for the news to spread beyond our street. Within days, local news stations were covering the story: unlicensed HOA guard arrested after pulling gun on off-duty FBI agent. Reporters flocked to the neighborhood. Cameras captured residents venting their frustrations, holding up their HOA fines, recounting stories of harassment that had gone ignored for months. The HOA board couldn't hide anymore. Their reputations were in shreds, lawsuits were being filed left and right, and their so-called security program was exposed as nothing more than a reckless, dangerous scam. The guard himself was denied bail, his criminal record plastered across the news. He had a history of violent outbursts, arrests for disorderly conduct, even a restraining order filed years earlier that the HOA had either ignored or never bothered to look into. The more people learned, the worse it got. And through it all, Danielle stayed calm, professional, never once boasting about what she had done. She didn't need to. Everyone who had been there that day had seen the truth with their own eyes. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt a shift. Not fear, not intimidation, but relief. The tyrant who had patrolled our streets was gone. The HOA's false authority was broken. And the residents finally had the courage to stand up and demand real accountability.